What was the last thing you recycled? What was it, and what do you think happened to it? So right here, I went through my recycling bin, and I've got two things. Uh, so this right here is an empty milk jug, and right here is a empty container of rice, which is made of cardboard. And so this plastic versus cardboard, these are different things, so they're likely recycled using different methods. And so today, that's what I will be going over in this presentation. So this is engineering the recycling process. My name is Jake Conway, and I'm a junior civil engineering major. So our recycling goes on a journey before becoming something new. Firstly, it is separated and recycled in different groups, and each of these groups has a different method that it is recycled by. And then I'll be going over how this recycling helps the environment. And finally, I will conclude by going over how some of the engineering that is involved in this recycling and the engineers that work at to build waste treatment facilities. Firstly, I'll be going over the separation and recycling in these different groups. So waste facilities separate materials that need to be recycled. So there are 4 groups, and that is paper, plastic, glass, and metal. Since these are different materials, they need to be separated and recycled in their own specific groups. So if you've ever seen Toy Story 3, or maybe if you need to remember it, at the end of the movie, they go to a waste treatment facility where the movie actually does, it shows some of the separation that actually occurs in real waste treatment facilities. So as I said, this is similar to what actually happens in waste treatment facilities. And in real facilities, they use mechanisms such as conveyor belts and magnets to separate magnetic and non-magnetic materials. So that's what you see in this graphic right here. The magnetic roller and the conveyor belt putting materials on it separates them into two separate groups. And this is just some early separation that occurs at waste treatment facilities. So now onto the recycling of these different materials, and these are formed into new products, these materials are. Firstly, the metals are melted and reused to make new cans and appliances. So metals are further separated into 2 groups, steel and aluminum. The reason behind this I will go over shortly. But first, aluminum is shipped to foundries where it is melted down, and once it's in its liquid form, it can be formed into new shapes, such as cans, as well as like aluminum foil. And aluminum cans can actually have a really short turnover, which can be as little as 60 days, which is relatively fast compared to some recycling that goes on with some metals. And next, there's steel. Steel is also shipped to foundries where it is melted down, and then it is formed into things such as appliances. It can also be used as like pipes and ductwork in buildings, as well as car and airplane parts. So as I said, aluminum and steel are separated into 2 separate groups, and this is done due to some of their magnetic properties, different properties that they have. So steel has iron, which is ferrous, and these ferrous metals are magnetic, where aluminum is non-ferrous and not magnetic. So there's a unique way of using magnets to separate these metals into their individual groups at these waste treatment facilities. Next, there is glass, and glass can be crushed, melted, and reformed into new shapes. So glass is separated into its own individual colors, and this is because the different colors of glass have different properties and melt at different temperatures and such. So they are individually separated and crushed, and once they're crushed, they can be melted down and formed into newer shapes, similar to aluminum. And aluminum is unique. I mean, glass is unique because it is nearly 100% recyclable, meaning it rarely loses quality or purity after the recycling. So the glass quality that you start with is usually what you end up with at the end. Next, there is plastic, and plastic is, again, separated into different groups, this time by the separate types of plastics that are used. So if you've ever noticed on some recyclable plastics, they have these triangles with numbers in them. On this milk jug that I showed you, there's this too. So these specify different plastics. These plastics have different properties, and engineers use different separation methods to separate plastics into these different groups. Some of this has to do with like density, different reactions to heat and such. And so these are separated into different groups where they are shredded down, and they can be heated and compressed into like little beads. And these little beads are very versatile in what they can be used. So these can be like shipped to different types of facilities where they can be used to make things such as toys, trash bags, carpets, clothing, etc. And finally, there's paper. So paper is pulverized, cleaned, and turned into new paper. So this starts by putting recyclable paper in really hot water, where it is broken down into a pulp with the assistance of some chemicals. And then it is pumped through these pipes, as you can see, where they are bleached, cleaned, and de-inked. And finally, they can spray this pulp onto wire racks, where they dry and can be run through heated rollers, which forms this pulp into actual usable paper once it dries, which is why the heated rollers are used. And this paper usually is used for things such as toilet paper, paper towels, newspapers, etc. So now that we've talked about how recycling, the separation and recycling processes that occur at waste treatment plants, we can continue on with how this recycling at these treatment facilities helps the environment. So what are some ways that you think recycling helps the environment? This could be that it keeps stuff out of landfills. It could be that it reduces pollution. It could also be that it reduces the need for new materials, and all of these would be correct. Additionally, recycling reduces greenhouse gas emissions and keeps the environment clean. So if you know what a greenhouse gas is, it's a gas that when sunlight goes through the atmosphere, the sunlight does not have enough energy to exit the atmosphere, which keeps all this heat energy in and contributes to climate change. So by recycling, this can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and can slow down climate change. Furthermore, by recycling, you reduce the amount of waste that is being produced, and so this can prevent wasted materials just being thrown into the ocean that can harm wildlife, such as like sea turtles or corals and such. So recycling also helps save energy. 1 year of recycling in the United States saves enough energy to power up to 30 million households, which if you take all the households in Nebraska, that's like 40 Nebraskas, which is quite significant and just shows how recycling is very helpful in reducing the amount of energy that the world in total has to spend, but in this case, the United States. So now that I've talked about how this recycling helps the environment, I could continue on with the engineering that is involved in waste treatment facilities and recycling as a whole. So engineers work together to make recycling better. Firstly, there are environmental engineers. These engineers work at these plants to make sure that they are not further harming the surrounding environment and making sure everything is safe and not polluting. Also, there are mechanical engineers, and these engineers tend to deal with moving parts and different types of mechanisms. So they would deal with like the separation processes and the recycling process that each of these materials go through at the facilities. Then there are process engineers. They deal with the efficiency of the plant itself and making sure it's as efficient as possible. And then there are electrical engineers. They deal with powering like these really large facilities and the many things that go on at them, but also they deal with magnets because most of these magnets are electromagnets, and so they will work with those as well. And finally, there are materials engineers, and they deal with making sure the materials that are coming out of these facilities and as well as going in are safe and quality products. So as you can see, our trash goes through a long journey before becoming something new. And this goes to show that engineers help improve our environment, our health, and our safety. So I appreciate you sticking around for this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to stick them in the comments. Thank you again. So real quickly, I wanted to go over some frequently asked questions that we have when we give this presentation at schools. And the first one has to deal with how are steel and aluminum separated? Because obviously we talk about magnets, but we don't exactly talk about how steel and aluminum are further separated, considering aluminum isn't magnetic. So this has to deal with the lens effect. So aluminum can be separated based off of magnetism on the lens effect. So the lens effect has to deal with a magnetic field when a conductive material goes through a magnetic field. It can induce an electrical current that drives a charge in that conductive material, which then creates its own magnetic field that conductive material does. So in this case, it would be like an aluminum can. There would be a charge that is driven through it that induces its own magnetic field that interacts with the magnetic field of a magnet or something. And that's why the conveyor belt moves. And so these two interact, and that's how aluminum can be separated using magnetism. And the next and final frequently asked question that we face is how are like we talked about the plastics and the different types of plastics, how are these separated? And as I touched upon in the presentation, this is usually due to the different different densities that these have. And so engineers will utilize different ways to use density to separate these plastics from one another.